I asked Phil to come today. He's an old Forest Service friend. He's a walking encyclopedia where the laws and regulations that are the stumbling blocks right now are concerned. Phil made a presentation to the board of directors of an organization called the National Association of Forest Service Retirees. I think was Phil last spring. Yeah, and they really liked it. Phil is actually a NAFSR member. I'm not because I never worked for the Forest Service, but I do a lot of work with him, and it's a pretty good outfit.
Well, it's indeed a pleasure to be here today. I love the subject of the conference. I'm not too worried about ammo, but what if you sharpened your Pulaski? That's what you're doing here today. You're sharpening your Pulaski. I spent the last 37 years working for the United States Forest Service, and then I went to the dark side. I worked for Forest Products Associations for the last 12 years. That's almost 50 years in higher math. So that's my experience base. I was vice president of the California Forestry Association and a consultant for the American Forest Resource Council in Eastern Washington. And I'm proud to say I'm a California equity refugee, having retired finally to Spokane. Question a lot of people have asked is what's happened to the Forest Service? With all my lifetime, it was a great organization to work for. In the 1960s, it was a federal agency with a esprit de corps and morale that was akin to the Marine Corps. There were two organizations in the federal government that stood proud, and the United States Forest Service was one of them. By 2009, in the Federal Diary, we find a publication of a government-wide survey of morale of the United States Forest Service and all public agencies. The morale was so bad that the discourse on the employees was horrendous. The morale was so bad that it was one quote that even the jobs that enjoy their jobs much more in the Forest Service are prison guards. So that dichotomy going from clear back to the 1960s to right now, the agency is in turmoil. This was not just a one-year study. The data were repeated, and there's been no improvement to date. But the best source for an in-depth understanding of what's happened to the United States Forest Service, I'd ask you to read this book by Alston Chase, In the Dark Wood. Every now and then a book appears that alters our way of thinking about the fundamental questions of politics and life. This is such a book. It is the story over the battle of old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. And you can see I've underlined, it's the biggest environmental conflict in American history. And we're all part of those consequences. That's what's going on. So what's happened in describing it, I'm not going to take the time to tell you what happened to the Forest Service. Read, you'll find out. You know, you're living. You know just as much as I do. But there's one thing that just happened that really says what the heck just happened. Is nothing sacred. The Forest Service recently said in August that you need to drop chocolate from your s'mores and replace it with bananas and fruit of some kind. What in the heck is going on? This came out of a Forest Service blog. Can you imagine what would happen if Gifford Pinchot heard that? This is a pronouncement from the agency that has to manage almost 200 million acres, and they're coming up with this kind of garbage. National reform efforts. In July of 26, 2013, a whole group of people from across the United States wrote a letter to Senator Wyden and Murkowski and said, "We are heartened by the bipartisan effort that recognizes the fact that the federal government's current approach to management is broken and needs to be assessed through legislation. The resiliency of our rural communities near national forest depends." You guys know all of this. This is all, but we finally got some national efforts going. Legislation needs to reduce the cost of environmental reviews, reduce the number of lawsuits and appeals after projects have been identified for environmental review. And who signed this letter? There was about 120 organizations, and you'll be proud to see that all of the county organizations were involved in this. It's all these organizations plus a whole lot more. This was signed last year. The need is now for reform. How do we capture that moment, plus approximately? Well, one of the things that happened, currently is going on, is H.R. 1526, Restoring Healthy Forests and the Healthy Forest Community Act. This has been passed by the Congress, but it's going nowhere. What did it say? We need to restore employment and educational opportunities in and improve the economic stability of the counties containing national forest land. Does anybody object to that? Okay, it sounds like that's okay. To ensure that the counties have a dependable source of revenue. Could you write that any better? My point is, this is already ongoing. To reduce the Forest Service management costs while also ensuring protection of the United States forest resources. I think we're preaching to the choir. One of the fundamental parts, it's a lengthy law, it's got all kinds of things, but the need for judicial reform is essential, and this bill contains some. In general, judicial review of forest projects in accordance with the Healthy Forest may not, the judges may not issue a restraining order, preliminary injunction, or injunction pending appeal. Cover the forest, you read it. So they're already dealing with one of the big issues that we have. It requires a bond. In the past, to appeal, we had a paradigm shift in the 1960s. Two paradigms was enough to pay for a postage stamp to file an appeal. So that paradigm shift cost us a lot of time and effort in the appeals and the litigation process when I was working in the Forest Service. Now, there would be some reform here and bonds are required. Let's deal with the serious questions rather than the institutions that legally have been developed that grow, such as the Center for Biological Diversity. How do they get paid? Profits from their lawsuits. The biggest growth industry is right there. Well, you got to play this game a little different. You got to post a bond. Further, if the secretary prevails in the case, the secretary shall submit a court motion for payment of all litigation expenses.
Amen.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Oh, yeah.
Would you guys want to get behind something like this? Do you need to rewrite this? Regional efforts, that's a national. Regional efforts. There's a whole bunch of regional advocacy groups to help you out. Sustainable Forest Action Coalition. This is from California. There's the Healthy Forest, Healthy Community Group. There's the Posse of Four. That's in counter to the Gang of Four. For you that were involved with the old growth controversies that Jack Ward Thomas, all these heavy breathing ecologists were involved in, we're the Posse of Four, and I'm one of the four. It's a group of us. Oh, a buddy of mine named Mike Newton. He's also part of this posse. Steve Neely, Nakazi, National Council Air Stream Improvement Group. They're having a meeting in October. The ONC Land, Oregon, California Land Exchange, that's BLM land. The Working Conservation Conference in October, coming up here in California. My point is there's tons and tons of efforts going on this reform, both at the national and at the local level. Our particular thing, the Posse of Four, what we're advocating is a fundamental principle of ecosystem management. We're not trying to assault ecosystem management, rather work with it, is that our federal public forests should be managed for all stages of forest succession and represented continuously in reasonable rate across the landscape. Rather than focus totally on old growth and old forest, why not have a balance of all several conditions? Jim talked about that. Our healthy, young, vibrant forests provide a lot of ecological value. You never hear the discussion about that. It's always about what the old growth forest provides. This means basically that all forests and all plants will be represented over time. Not just featured species, but all species. Now, I mentioned Steve Neely, Nikazi. They're having a meeting coming up here, and he's looking for a reform on the old Northwest Forest Plan. And there's a whole bunch of people that are behind them. In summary, the impact of the Northwest Forest Plan on the physical, social, and economic landscape cannot be overstated. The promises stated in the Northwest Forest Plan have never been accomplished. It's almost like the promises from the National Forest. Now we have it localized based upon something in planning. Steve says the Northwest Forest Plan must get it right. Couldn't agree more. The stakes are high for Oregon, so you're not alone with the U.S. Anyway, it keeps going on and on and on. Results, none today. No response from any member of Congress. Let me repeat that. No response from any member of Congress. Predictably, because of the preoccupation of H.R. 1526, the Senate is not interested in this. Senator Wyden has his own reform bill that has some support, but it's not widespread support like we need. Reforms, what could they look like? This is just one man's opinion. There's an old forester named Heinrich Cotta in 1816. He said that three principal causes exist why forestry is so backward. First, the long time it takes wood to develop, 100 years, 80 years, and so on. It takes a long time. Trees I planted 50 years ago, they're harvesting them now in some spots. Second, the great variety. Just think about the Idaho Panhandle Forest. How many variety of sites they have. Third, the fact that the forester who practices much writes little, and he who writes much but practices little. That's 1816, folks. That was psyched out, and I think we see a lot of that now. Again, but how do we get these reforms going? Now I'd like to change a little bit around. We need to establish principles rather than a how-to. It goes back to what Pinchot was saying, some principles. And this is Phil's opinions. And this is what I presented to my colleagues at the National Association of Forest Service Retirees. What should we get behind? First opinion. The first principle is the National Forest will be managed to obtain the optimum benefits from the inherent resilient nature of forest. Not the maximum, but the optimum set of benefits. Now, to fight this, now you've got to be opposed to the words in there. In other words, I'm not really for obtaining the optimum benefits, less than optimum. So you change the words around to work on principles. National forests will be managed to obtain a balance of habitats, emphasizing seeking a balance of sustainable several conditions by forest type. Now, obviously you have to work on the words on that because a lot of people are lost. What the hell are you talking about? And things like that. But this says clearly we want a balance, not just old forest. That's a principle. In contrast, wilderness areas will be managed to allow natural processes to occur. And that's what should happen in wilderness areas. I don't have any claims. If they want to burn them up, let them burn up. Let Mother Nature have it. The point is they're established to allow natural processes. The principles continue. National forests will be managed to develop and improve the economic resources for local communities that they encompass. That's a principle. It's not in our current set of principles that manage the national forest. National forests, this is one of my personal issues. National forests will be allowed and encouraged to develop and use funds from resource management. The economic potential from our national forest is huge. This is above the 25% funds that we collect and return to the counties. That would be retained as that. But if you put a responsible manager and say, look, you can use the funds to help improve the national forest, and we need to create this thing called the National Forest Reinvestment Act. What's wrong with using the funds like that if we can produce excess revenues? Access to the national forest will be considered an asset and not a liability. So far, so many of our national forests have converted to a no trespassing concept. We want to change that dynamic around and say that roads and access are an asset. In any civilized nation on earth, access is paramount to development of the people of that country and land. Principles continue. Special management areas outside of wilderness area will allow the removal of trees and other vegetation and other management activities to achieve the short and long-term goals. We have tons and miles and acres of wild and scenic river that have become de facto no harvesting allowed. Yet in many cases, that would be the best thing to do to that area. Riparian areas are not no-touch areas. You can change stream dynamics around by simply altering the combination of trees that are around. And you can favor threatened and endangered species by actively managing your riparian areas. Jim, in contrast to what you think, I think salvage and reforestation should be a principle, and it's exempt from appeals and lawsuits. The state of California, in their infinite wisdom, says that salvage on private land is exempt from the California Forest Practices Act, which is the most onerous Forest Practice Act in the United States, if the lands are burned, because they recognize you need that time to quickly recover the land. If they wait 6 months, guess what? They got to go through the whole Harvest Practice Act. So it's good enough for the state of California. It ought to be good enough for the United States Forest Service lands. In resolving conflicts on the individual national forests, local considerations will govern, providing that the principles that you establish can be met. Finally, forest management plan. I worked in for every form of forest management plan that's ever been conceived. And most of them, the debate ends up over what you say is going to happen. And rather than focusing on what you're going to do, focus on a broad range of alternatives, describing the economic, social, and environmental consequences of each alternative. No decisions are made at that time. Why? Because actual real decisions are made at the time of the appropriation. You may say there's a potential to harvest 100 million board feet, but you only get the appropriations to harvest 20 million feet. Why are you arguing the debate on 100 million feet? But really describe that consequence. Third-party certification will be required in the development of planning documents. The current set of regulations on plans are this big. I would say that's all of the regulations you need, the marching orders. Actual land management decision make at the project level. Demonstrated performance is a principle of the project decisions will be evaluated by a local accountability board, not just the United States Forest Service. There would be a role for the county to annually review the performance of their local national forest and have input into the regional forester for the performance rating of that forest supervisor. So there is a sense of accountability. Right now, there's nothing like that in there. The Gordian knot. How much time do I have?
6 minutes.
Good. The Gordian knot of planning actions is, that basically is the laws. There are 1,174 pages of laws and regulations affecting the national forest as we sit here. Most of the forest officers are violating some of that just about every day of the year. Laws are like ecosystems. They're connected. No one has ever looked at the connection between the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Forest Management Act, and all of these acts ad nauseum. They're passed as if they're individual things. Well, given that, I say, so what? Leave them alone. Learn to work within those laws like the Endangered Species Act and actually take the time at the planning to show exactly what happens at implementing the consequences of these laws. I was involved in a project called the Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project in the 90s. Congress asked us, I was with Forest Service Research at the time, to look at all of the activities in the entire Sierra Nevada and write a report to Congress on the action of that. It had to be done by an independent panel of scientists, and we did that, reported to Congress. And it's like most science, we already knew that information. They just brought it together in one place. Subsequently, the United States Forest Service did an evaluation of the entire Sierra Nevada. And in that, they had to project what were the consequences of their action. And here's an example, the wildfire acres. This is with no active management. Notice that the consequences to wildfires are greatest with no active management. 99% of the time, which you are dealing, you're fighting your proposed action against other proposed action. The real culprit out there is not doing anything. Here's a way to do it. Make sure you describe no active management. Then we looked at the 1990 to 2000 period of management. We were doing that. This was the selected Sierra Nevada Conservation Framework decision. Guess what? There was another alternative that would even reduce it less. Now we did this for literally 20-some different elements, including economic variables and so on. So you knew the consequences of all of these actions. So here you can talk about things like how many acres are likely to burn. Not only can you just burn, some burns are actually quite beneficial. Well, what about the lethal burns? We had that kind of data as well. Now the other big thing down there was old growth. Well, here we had no active management. That's how much old growth you produced. What happened to it? It all got burned up and the bugs got to it. So we put all of that data in one place. There was a decision. It didn't really help a heck of a lot. And then you had the 1990, and then there were the best option. Guess what? That best option produced the most board feet. My point is, these are the consequences on 11 million acres of land. It's not necessarily, these things are not necessarily on Shoshone County, but even greater than that, the entire Idaho Panhandle National Forest. If you want a critter to survive, you got to look at the range of that critter, and it's usually much larger. And you can evaluate those consequences, and generally, the best example you can have for these kinds of things is to actively manage your forest. Finally, open the debate on a new Organic Act. The Organic Act of 1897, that's where I'm going to close, 1897, yes, basically said that the purpose for the national forest are the three things: protect the headwaters of navigable streams. Protect the headwaters of navigable streams. How have we done on that lately, folks? Provide for the protection and maintenance of the forest reserves. Provide for the protection and maintenance of the forest reserves. How have we done on that lately, folks? As a matter of fact, when Congress created the funding, they actually had what was called P&M funds, for protection and maintenance funds. And they were used to directly address the P&M function of the Organic Act. The third major element was provide a continuous supply of timber for the citizens of the United States. And many people have argued that it really doesn't talk about quantity or anything like that, but rather a continuous supply. And the Forest Service can look in the eye and say, yeah, we did that. But the opportunity costs foregone are vast. So I think it's time to open up the debate on a new Organic Act. It might not pass, but just because Pinchot and our history tells us what we got there, that's fine. The history tells us how we got there. It's most important, where are we going? How do we get there? And I've got all kinds of ways to do that. But I don't think I'm going to bore you any much more on that. The point is it's time to understand our history and move well beyond this. This is the 21st century, and the decisions we make now will be talked about in the 22nd century. And we should have an Organic Act that really looks at what was going on currently in our time.
Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop. That's enough of my presentation. Thank you.
How do we sign on to show support for HR 1526? If we're not listed on there, and
I think that the old train has already gone down the track, the caboose, you're way beyond that. Let me give you my personal views on what's going to happen politically. Nothing's going to happen politically until such time as there's a new administration. The Forest Service representing the current administration actually argued against 1526. It has not been taken up by the Senate, nor do they expect it to be taken up by the Senate. My view is, my own personal view is we need a change in the Senate first. And if we get a change in the Senate, boy, that Pulaski has to be real sharp. Secondarily, even if that change happens, there's the veto. We're not going to get a veto-proof set of forest legislation. The current administration is kowtowing to the green or environmental movement. They will never, ever sign off on any new legislation as long as the current president's in place. Just ask yourself, what's the delay in the pipeline, the oil pipeline? It's gone through all that process. If you think about it, it's changed into a political football. And until there's a change in the administration, I think that's ultimately the time period where we can actually see some real changes. Doesn't help you folks dealing with local issues here. But I think your taxes, the Pulaski's ought to be real sharp to focus on change in the Senate and the change in the administration.
Thank you, Phil, for the presentation.
Yeah.